Well, this was done, I think, well, I can tell you when it was, what the copyright date on it is.
We're going to consider the
2003,
Christian's
John.
relationship to the sphere
I'm going
of
to go ahead and mute
economics.
everybody so that there's
It seems, I know at first glance, that for the Christian to even be concerned about economics seems so mundane and so worldly that most of us as Christians spend very little time even considering some of the issues that are involved in economics. But I think we're all aware of what's taken place in the last few years that has provoked a crisis of economics in our own culture, so much so that newspaper headlines and front page stories dealing with this central issue of economics are a daily occurrence. It used to be that the only time we read about economics would be on the business pages of the newspaper, but presidential elections, congressional elections now hinge on questions of economic policy. And it's true not only here in the United States, but the problems of economics are worldwide in scope in our generation. We've been told by the sociologists and the historians that the planet has shrunk in size by means of communication to the degree that now we describe our planet as a global village. So that what happens in Afghanistan has repercussions in Indonesia, and what happens in Indonesia affects the marketplace in the United States. And so there's a sense in which the whole world now is in the grips of a serious recession. And everybody's concerned about it because at a very practical level, it affects the material well-being of your life and of everybody else's life. And so, for no other reason, economics is a concern to us because of its practical implications. But beyond that, as Christians, we are called to be profoundly concerned with ethics. And the point that is often overlooked is that economics touch very, very heavily on the arena of ethics. Every economic decision, every time that you choose how to spend a dollar or what to do with a dollar, or every time an economic policy is embraced or legislated by a government, ethical decisions are being made. Because economics have to do with the means of exchange, with the monetary systems and so on, of a given culture. And we are dealing immediately with the question of value. And value is an ethical matter. Now, when we go to look at the whole science of economics, we understand that the very word economics comes from an interesting Greek word, which I'll try to transliterate. Oikonomia. Oikonomia is the Greek word from which the English word economy or economics derives. But in the New Testament, you'll meet this term, oikonomia, frequently, but it won't be translated by the English word economy or economics. Does anybody know what word is used in the English text of the Bible to translate that Greek word? Does anybody know? Oikonomia is translated in the New Testament by the word stewardship. Now you say Christians maybe aren't all that concerned about economics, but is the New Testament concerned about stewardship? On page after page after page. Comes from a combination of two words. Oiko is an abbreviated form of the word oikos, which is the Greek word for house. And we all know what the word nomos means, don't we? What does that mean? We all know it. We're just shy and embarrassed to shout it out. What is it? Name, no, nomina is the Latin for name. But nomos, we've seen it in autonomy and theonomy. What does nomos mean? Antinomianism? Never heard that word? Nomos is the Greek word for law. And oikonomia has to do with house law or house rule. And the idea is that the steward, biblically, is the one who is placed in authority, in a position of rulership over the house. And a steward does not own the house. He works for the owner of the house, and he is given authority, however, to manage the house. Now, ultimately, the global house, biblically, is the world. That's our home. Who owns the world, ultimately? God does. And man is placed in this world as a steward of God's house. So that economics have to do with managing the resources that ultimately belong to God. And we are held accountable for what we do in that management process of taking care of the world that God has given us. You know, I just did a couple of radio programs yesterday on the Gospel of Luke, and we did two parables back to back. One of them was the parable of the prodigal son, and the next one was the parable of the unjust steward. And they have different points and different concerns in those parables, but we saw one interesting parallel. The prodigal son, after he received his inheritance, went to a far country, and he did what? He wasted his substance. He wasted his substance. And then we turned to the unjust steward, and the reason why the steward in the parable was dismissed by the owner or by his employer was because he wasted the goods of the owner of the house. And in both parables, we see the negative judgment of God falling upon waste. To waste one's substance is an economic problem and an economic issue. Well, we understand that when we go to the Bible, we find allusions, such as we've just seen in those parables, to economic issues. But the Bible is not a technical textbook on economic theory, is it? We can't go to the Bible and find a detailed blueprint for economic policy, because that's not the purpose of the Bible. So therefore, many Christians have come to the conclusion that the Bible is irrelevant to the field of economics, but that's not the case. The Bible does set forth some very important principles that we must grapple with if we're going to be involved with economic policy and decision making. And I want to take a minute here to list a few principles that are clearly set forth in the Scripture. There are more principles touching on economics than the ones I'm about to put on the board. But these four are four that tend to jump out at you, that are repeated again and again and again. They're basic and foundational to Christian principles concerning economics. The first is the principle of private property. The second is the principle of equity. The third is the principle of industry. And the fourth is the principle of compassion. Now, I said a moment ago that the Bible is not a textbook, a scientific textbook on economics. However, it seems as though the competing economic theories and economic systems that are on a collision course in this world all try to appeal at one point or another to the Bible to gain an authority base for their programs. Communism points, for example, to illustrations in the book of Acts where the early church people held things in common. And those who are advocates of communism, not the Marxist sense, but still communal living, appeal to the Bible for the platform for their economic policies. Socialism, which seeks a transfer society by which the government is involved in the redistribution of wealth, has as its premier goal equality of wealth and participation in wealth and equality in ownership within a culture. And socialism as an ism historically has been very, very much concerned with the plight of poor people and of oppressed people. The motivation, historically, for most varieties of socialism has been to redress the wrongs and the inequities and the injustices that have been perpetrated against the poor in this world. In other words, the strongest motivating force, I would say, of socialism historically has been compassion. And does the Bible illustrate a concern for the material well-being of the poor? Does the Bible call us to redress economic inequities? Of course. Does the Bible call us to manifest compassion? Yes. And so we can see how certain strands of the Bible are become very important to socialist economic theory, and certain aspects of biblical ethics are incorporated into it. Then there's capitalism, which has been linked historically again and again with Christian theology, particularly with Protestant theology, with its emphasis on the so-called work ethic. Does the Bible have a strong call to industry? Yes. Capitalism has also appealed to the primary principle of private ownership as a biblical ethic. Does the Bible advocate private property? We've seen, for example, a moment ago that the whole world belongs to God and we are their stewards, so that in an ultimate sense we don't own anything. But in a penultimate sense, in a proximate sense, in terms of living in this planet, God does set forth principles of private ownership. And He protects the rights of private property in the Bible. Look at the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not covet. Both of those commandments presuppose private property. And so you have all of these different disparate systems appealing to the Scriptures. And part of the reason is because of the central importance of these four ideas that come across in Scripture. Private property. The capitalist stands here. Private property embarrasses the socialist, and it embarrasses the communist. Equity embarrasses the capitalist. That becomes a very important point for the socialist. Industry. Well, everybody claims to be industrious, and everybody wants to be compassionate. But if I were to take any one of these four and say that it is most central to the biblical concern for economics, it would be this one: equity. And the second one would be compassion. To translate that into biblical categories, the Bible again and again reduces the essence of godly behavior to two virtues: justice and what? Mercy. And it's very easy to set justice and mercy over against each other, but the Bible refuses to do that. We are called to be working for justice, and we're being called to work for mercy. I am not a socialist by any stretch of the imagination. And the reason I am not a socialist is that I am convinced that socialism destroys this principle. and substitutes a principle that sounds like equity but is not equity, and it is the concept of equality. Egalitarianism, in the sense that the goal of the socialist is an equal distribution of wealth, which I would be willing to say, in a perfect society, would certainly be a noble thing. It would be great, wouldn't it, that if everybody participated equally in the enormous riches and wealth that this world affords. But the problem that socialism doesn't come to grips with fully is that we don't live in an unfallen world. We live in a fallen world. And in a fallen world, there will inevitably be inequities or inequalities of participation in welfare where some people will be more responsible than others. And equity or justice requires that the responsible person not be penalized for being responsible, and that slothfulness not be rewarded. But if we have a great leveling process where we take from those who are productive and gratuitously assign it to those who are not, we violate biblical principles of justice. Now, we do that in the name of compassion. But compassion is restricted to one group. Now, I think you do have in the Bible a work ethic that calls us to industry, to production, to labor, and that God sanctifies labor. And it's important to remember that work or labor does not come to us as a result of the fall. But our God is a working God. Our God creates through divine industry. And He calls man to mirror and reflect that operation. God assigns labor to man before the fall. God does not simply put man in a garden of paradise and say, rest 7 days a week. But He is called to dress that garden, to till that garden, to cultivate that garden, to replenish that garden, to multiply, and in other words, He is called to be productive. And that is integral to your vocation as a human being, to be productive, to bring forth the fruit of our labor. All right? Now, the principle biblically is that you are to be able to participate in the ownership of what you produce. And that the system of law that we find in the Old Testament is to protect your private property from theft, from fraud, from deceit, and so on. Numerous laws in the Old Testament are set forth to ensure honesty in the business world and in the marketplace, so that it is unlawful, according to God, to use false weights and measures, to debase the currency of a society, but there is to renege on contractual promises and obligations, the breaking of covenants, the breaking of industrial contracts, as well as religious covenants, are all related together here. And so equity is an important principle of economics, that justice be done. And again, industry, but compassion. What do you do with those who lack the means or the opportunity or the motive? Do we close our hearts to the poor? No, God has a special concern for the poor, doesn't He? He demands in the Old Testament law that the fields be left at the corners to be gleaned by the poor. Poor laws are given by God to make sure that the poor are not ignored. And most importantly, that the poor are not discriminated against at the gates, which means where? In the law courts of the land. And that the poor not be exploited or denigrated or demeaned by the rich and the powerful. And the Bible warns about what happens to a person who makes the supreme goal of his life the acquisition of riches. The Bible says no to a crass form of materialism. The Bible says that life is more than wealth, doesn't it? But the Bible also says no to spiritualism, which says it's inconsequential about what happens to man's body or man's material well-being. There's a pox on both houses. God has created a physical world, and He's created people with souls, but also who have bodies. And God's redemption includes bodily redemption. God is concerned about shelter, about food, about clothing. Read through the Bible. The Bible's not an exercise in abstract spiritualism. Part of these concerns about righteousness and about justice and about compassion are concerns that touch the economic situation of humanity. The term poor may be used figuratively in the Bible to refer to those who are poor in spirit, but its primary usage are those who are poor in terms of material goods and material things. And Jesus, at the heart of His teaching, says what? If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's naked, clothe him. What's Jesus saying there? He's saying, in the most simplest level, God cares about your physical well-being. That you have enough to eat, that you are protected from the elements, that you have clothes, that you have a place to live. That's an economic matter. Now, so my bottom line at this point is this, that man's material welfare is a major concern of God and must always be a major concern of God's people. I'm a capitalist, what I call a stewardship capitalist, because I believe that the principles of stewardship demand certain principles that capitalism embraces. However, capitalism can be seen and described and defined as a license for crass materialism with no consideration or care for the poor. But I care about the poor. And I believe that if we're going to care about the poor, we have to say no to systems like socialism and communism, because in the final analysis, they kill the poor. Virtually every significant effort to improve the standard of living of people that has been brought to this planet by socialistic or communistic theories of economics have failed miserably. Let me give you a case in point. Since the communist revolution in China, the production, the standard of living, and the per capita income of the people of China has steadily decreased to levels worse than what it was before the revolution. Formosa, which was the free aspect of China, has 18 million people. China has 1 billion people. The standard of living, or the personal income on Formosa, is 5 times higher per capita than on the mainland China. Now here's one that I want you to know. In the decade of the 70s, the 18 million people on Formosa exported 50 times more goods than the billion people in communist China. Now, I want to give a formula very quickly for economics that won't touch all the details, but cuts down to the basal foundational principles that I want you to keep in your head as you wrestle through the particular problems that we confront in a complex economic society. And these are the basic principles. That God is concerned about man's material life. His food, his shelter, his clothing, these things. Now, the most important single ingredient to benefit man's physical needs is production. Without production, we don't have the food to feed people, we don't have the clothes to clothe them, we don't have the houses to shelter them. It's a very simple, I'm trying to make this as simple as I possibly can. The most single important factor to increase the physical, material well-being of this race of people is production. Now, that is, the more that it is produced, the better the standard of living people have. And I might add, just as a sideline here, the more quantity of things that are produced, what happens to the cost per unit of those things? Yes, the more shirts you produce, the less each individual shirt costs. The more scarce, the more it costs. Now, increased production benefits who the most? The poor man. Because now the goods that he needs is more easily accessible to him. So production is crucial. And what we've seen in our culture is a steady decline in the United States over the last 20 years of productivity. There are reasons for that. The next thing is, what is the most single important ingredient for production? Karl Marx understood the answer to this question. And the fact, I'm asking now about the ABCs of economics. The single most important factor for increased production is tools. Why is it that a peasant in Colombia cannot produce as much food stuff as an American farmer? Is it because the American farmer is more intelligent or he's physically stronger? No. A man with a mechanized instrument can produce 100 times more than a man with wooden implements. Tools are what revolutionized the world in terms of the production of material goods. 100 years ago, 80%, I believe, or something like that, of the population of the United States were farmers. And today, it's like 3%. And they produce more food than what people 100 years ago could do with 80% of the population. Why? Because of modern techniques of production that are based upon tools. Tools are crucial to production. Now, what's the single most important necessary ingredient for tools? Inventiveness. Can't have tools unless somebody invents them, that's for sure. Factories to produce them, yes. Manpower, you got to have men to have tools, that's true. Well, not capitalism, but capital. Money. One of the big differences between that poor peasant in Colombia and the American farmer is that peasant doesn't have the tool. Why doesn't he have the tool? It's not that the tools aren't available. The tools are there, but he doesn't have the money to buy them. It takes money to be converted into tools, to convert into productivity, to increase the level and standard of living in the world. Do you see that? That's crucial. Now here's why I bring this up. Because, dear friends, this becomes the point of attack in the modern world. People say we are against capital. And I'm talking about excess capital. I'm talking about investment capital. So if you make more money than you need to live on, then the socialist dream is to take that excess and distribute it around. And immediately, the key and most crucial ingredient for this whole process of increasing the well-being of man has now been destroyed. Because without surplus capital, there will be no increase of tools. Without increase of tools, there will be no production. Without production, the whole welfare of man falls. Now I'm going to take one quick more minute to point one other thing here. Where does capital for investment come from? I should put another line down below capital here. What is the one thing that capital depends on? An obscene word in our culture. Profit. Profit. I just want to say this and then we'll stop. That profit is the goal of all economic exchange. We can theorize all we want and say that profit's no good or profit's obscene or the profits are too high or the profits are too low or so on. But every time an economic transaction takes place and goods are exchanged, the goal in that exchange is profit. I don't care whether it happens in a communist country or in a capitalist country. The goal is profit. Every time you are involved in an economic transaction, you are looking for profit and you are looking in profit. In fact, if profit is not active, there will be no exchange. It's the very basis for commerce. And the ideal business thing takes place. The deal is made when who profits? Both! That is absolutely necessary for a free exchange of commerce, that both sides profit. The difference is we don't want the same thing. And the deal takes place when I want your product more than I want my money, and you want my money more than than you want your own product. That's business. That's commerce. That's how the diversity of enterprise and business and commerce takes place in the world that makes it possible for man to live at all. All right, in our next session, we'll look at the Christian and the political arena.
Okay, John, I muted you so that we didn't get any feedback during the. So there you are. All right.
Hello.
Oh. Any comments?
Of course, that was dated. China has exports a whole lot more than Taiwan now, because the way I understand it is they threw out Marx and started using a capitalistic system for their economy while maintaining ironclad control over their people politically.
Yeah, they've sort of melded some things together. But the bottom line is, as he said, even in communism, the idea of profit is there. You know, when you have an exchange of any kind, somebody's trying to make a profit one way or the other. And as he explained it, if I get a product from you, my profit is the product. Your profit is the money that I give to you. So whatever the excess of what the production costs were and transportation and all those things, that's your profit. So you determine, you know, how much money you need to get out of something. And I have to make a decision as to whether or not I'm willing to pay that.
Right.
And that's what drives the whole issue. And
Yes.
So, you know, I found it real interesting to hear, you know, his take on things, because, you know, he basically, and I sent you an email earlier that has an article by Al Mohler on it. And it is, it's titled "Toward a Christian View of Economics." And I don't know that if this might have been in a Table Talk article a while back. I'm not sure what the date on this is. I might find it here. Yeah, it was published in Table Talk, but it doesn't give the date. But I sent that article to you just because he lists 11 or 12 things that he feels is what the Christian view of economics, and we can look at that in a few minutes when we go through some of these other things here. I found it interesting that we see him talking about how there's ethics in economics. And that's because economics has to do with value, and it has to do with value of the people involved in the process of economics, so that so that you don't have, well, when there's a hurricane goes through, or there's a flood, a tornado or whatever, what do they have to guard against is price gouging, because it tends then to kind of undermine the whole idea of surplus and scarcity, so that there's controls put in place to keep that from happening. And that's where the ethics comes in. We want to, and because there's ethics involved, what's one of the primary problems that results from ethics?
Well, you have someone like Ahab who coveted Naboth's field, his vineyard, and so he behaved very unethically.
Right. And so, as RC said, one of the things that has to be an ingredient in economics is compassion. He talked about the 4 principles repeated in the Bible are private property, equity, industry, and compassion. I think he pointed out, I think, something interesting in that equity has sort of become equality.
Yes.
And so that's and so why did that become a problem?
Well, this goofy notion that you're supposed to have equality of outcome. I think it's the most asinine thing. It's empirically false. And it just gives goofy people an excuse to mess things up.
Okay. Why are those people goofy?
Why are they what?
Goofy. I'm using your terminology, but I think it fits.
Well, just compare IQ tests.
Well, I don't know. I don't know that you can do that, because I certainly probably don't think that my IQ is anywhere near some of the folks that are making these decisions, because I don't really know.
But that's just one example. People aren't equal in ability. I mean, why people can't figure that out? They assume that, well, it's very Marxist. We've got to tinker around with the economic system and social system to force equality of outcome.
Well, okay, and so I go back to my question. Why is it that there's a problem that specifically we talked about equity becoming equality. Um, uh, what's the bottom line issue?
Well, if you can bamboozle the people who are not producing a lot, saying it's because of these evil capitalists, and I'm going to fix your problem, then they'll vote you into power.
Okay, but we still haven't dug deep to what the real issue is.
The real issue of the inequity of distribution.
Well,
Well,
yeah,
well, there
because
is.
I mean, if we take any of these things, if we take private property where there are movements to limit property, you know, I'm not allowed to put a building up attached to my house without getting certain permits.
Yeah.
Why is that? Why, you know, um, it's driven by the need to have money coming in. So there's to pay for programs that in some cases are totally opposed to Christian ethics and values. So I think of any though it's been minimized, but any government support of abortion, directly or indirectly, the government has found ways to get more money coming in, even without taxing you. So you have to pay for permits. You have to do things a certain way. One of the things that we have a stormwater fee based on the amount of impervious material around our house, which includes the roof, the driveways, anything like that. So they've devised ways to raise money beyond taxing people. But why? My question is why?
The more money they have, the more power they have to create mischief.
And so the bottom line of creating mischief is sin. That's what I'm driving at. I mean, we can say, we can point to what the symptoms are, but the bottom line is that people take a good system and they pervert it because they're sinful.
Yeah.
And so so profit becomes a dirty word to people, not because it's a bad thing, but because they think it's bad. I had a conversation with a guy when I worked for the Juvenile Justice Department. We were talking, and he was a veteran. He was in the Air Force when he was serving, and he actually worked at the the nuclear missile bases, I think, in North Dakota. And his take on things was that the distribution of wealth was a good thing. I couldn't understand him having those liberal ideas when he was a military guy. A lot of times, to me, that just doesn't compute well. But he was just adamant, no matter what type of I'll say argument, any type of issue that I tried to address, he still came back to this thing of distribution of wealth. I think one of the problems is people see distribution of wealth as maybe a good thing. The problem is the distribution of wealth is in the wrong hands. We-
Yeah, well, it's all very well and good, and as long as it's not their wealth that gets distributed.
Well, no, what I mean is the distribution of wealth by the government, that's the wrong hands. The distribution of wealth needs to be handled compassionately by Christians, so that when somebody has a need, we address the need. We don't just say, well, here's this need, we're going to have a program to cover all these people. And so what happens is you have the program there and it's not controlled. So you have sinful, evil people that do things to make that program something it's not, or they go in and uh, they make money on on things. You know, it's when Hurricane Andrew hit Miami, we learned something very interesting, and that was when now here's a system in place that is to make sure that buildings are done properly, which is not a bad thing. You want buildings to be sustainable. And but what they found was the roofs were blowing off of these buildings in the wind and in the hurricane. And what they found out when they went in was the corruption in the inspection process allowed people, contractors, to nail 4 nails in a 4x8 panel in a roof.
Hmm.
And that was widespread, because what was going on is the contractor would call the inspector and say, hey, I need an inspection done. What day are we playing golf? You know, so they would take the guy golfing and he would approve the inspection without checking it out. So when we took a group to Miami, they really uh, um, uh, came down on the inspections, and actually you had to get everything inspected. If you put the roof panels on, they had to be inspected. When you put the shingles on, they had to be inspected, and they would come in and lift shingles to make sure there were nails like every 6 to 8 inches or whatever the code called for. So they would take up shingles that were already down, that you know, and see, that's the corruption of the system. And no matter what program you put into place, no matter what you try to do to redistribute the wealth, somebody gets in there and embezzles money, sets up a scheme to make more money. You know, I mean, you hear about Medicare fraud, Medicaid fraud all the time, all the time. People that Maryland worked with. So that's what I'm saying is economics is the driving force in society. And if it's built on a Christian model and Christian people are running it, then it's going to be a compassionate thing. So my point is this, after all that, my point is this: the churches should be running the distribution of wealth, so that if somebody has a need, like in Acts, the people come together and they help that person. They deal with that person's issues, and it becomes a case by case basis rather than a broad stroke like the government does. And because it's a broad stroke, it leaves the door open for the corruption that arises out of it. You know, even in the church, we can have corruption. We've had several instances of embezzlement and things. So it can happen even in the church, but I think there's less of a chance. Now, if you go back 150 years, who was doing most of the charitable work?
The churches.
The churches. And it was only when the New Deal came in, yeah, it was the New Deal, right? That was because they
Yeah.
did all these different programs. When the New Deal came in, they started taking that taking that away from the churches. And I'm sure the churches at the time felt like, well, that's less of a burden on us, and they were probably given over to it fairly easily because they're not thinking in terms necessarily, well, this is going to turn into something sinful. We can look back and see that it's taking people's property, whether they take it in a physical sense of taking the property, or they take money that's the property of the individual or whatever. Just seems to me that the economics got really strewed. That's not what I wanted to say. Got skewed. I was sort of between
Well, it did get
I was
screwed.
sort of between screw and skew.
Well, it did get screwed. That's an equally accurate term.
but see, and that's, once you give that up, it's I think it's impossible, short of revival, to get it back. It's like once you go to the well, you're going to go back, as the old saying goes. So anyway, well, let's look and see what some of the things that I think we've just basically said that. What does all this have to do with Christianity? It has to do with the fact that Christians used to do what the government's been doing now for 85, 100, well, almost 100 years. So, and I think another thing is we have to be aware of what we're doing with our funds, and how we take and use our funds for various reasons and various things. What do you think the answer to this is, John? What is the biblical injunction to the Christian regarding economics?
Boy, that's such a broad question. Where do you start?
Yeah.
I agree. You need to, well, when we were in Indianapolis, we were told when you see somebody begging on the street, you can't tell if he's a con artist, if he's in really need. Refer him to the what was it? It was the Wheeler mission, which was their equivalent of the Mooresville mission, because those guys are really good at ferreting out who was in need and who was a con artist. Of course, the con artists wouldn't show up at the Mooresville mission; they just keep on begging.
Right. We had a situation when I came down here to work in a church. We got a phone call at the church, and the secretary came in and said, this guy wants to talk to somebody from the church, but he won't talk to the pastor and he won't talk to me, because he'd already talked to them. So I was next in line. So I talked to this guy. His name was Walter Boozer.
Boozer
was his last name. So he gave me this story about how he rented his furniture and he didn't get his check. He's waiting for his disability check. Just, he had all kinds of excuses.
Yeah.
And the rental company was going to come in and take the TV, and he needed the TV because he had kids, and, just gave me this whole story. And I said, I can't do anything for you personally, but let me get you in touch with our deacons and let the deacons work with you. So they started working with him. They paid his power bill. They said to him, let's get rid of all your rental furniture. We'll take care of covering the bill, and we'll take you to Goodwill and we will buy stuff for you so that, you know, you don't have these bills hanging over your head. And,
Who's going to do this?
pardon me?
Who was going to pay for all this?
The deacons at the church were working with him to do that.
Oh,
But the key was that he and his wife were supposed to sit down with the deacons and work on their finances, get a budget set up so that they could get out of this situation.
mm-hmm.
Well, he wouldn't do that because obviously his wife did not know he was begging. So he wouldn't do that. So I left that church and eventually wound up at Prosperity. So we got a call up there. Marlene, I think Steve's wife, took the call, and she came out and said, "Dennis, this guy's on the phone, and he wants to talk to somebody." And I went back and I said, "Hello," and he said, "This is Walter Boozer." And I said, "Walter," I said, "it took you this long to get from the B's in the phone directory to the P's." And I told him, I said, "You know, I talked to you when I was at this other church. We explained to you how we were going to handle it. And I'm going to tell you, we would do it the same way here. If you've got some needs, we'll help address them, but you've got to get working on a budget." Well, needless to say, he wasn't interested in that either. But that, you know, I mean, it's just so, and I just had a conversation on this next door neighbor. I don't know if you know what that is. It's like a Facebook for neighborhoods. And somebody posted that they were at the shopping center over here, and they were approached by somebody asking basically for money. And before they could even do anything, the person was gone. But she was sort of saying, "Well, you know, this is the thing." Well, I told her, you know, I sent a reply to this whole thread of conversations. I said, "It's good practice not to give money.
Mm-hmm.
What you do is you offer to buy them food or to buy, you know, what they need to have. If they accept that you will do that for them, then, you know, get them a meal, take them into Wendy's, do whatever you need to do."
I've done that very thing.
Yeah, Cindy was working in downtown Detroit. There'd be these panhandlers who try to get a hold of her on her way to lunch. And when she'd say, "Well, let me buy you lunch," and most of them be pretty shirty about it.
But there was
But the one lady who accepted is very grateful.
Wanted lunch.
Yeah, I've only had a couple of folks accept that offer.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, but see, the people that work with the homeless basically tell you, don't give money to them. Charlotte, for example, has enough services to take care of these people.
Mm.
You know, I mean, there's a tremendous structure for helping the homeless. There's a lot of churches that provide food. They get down and they set up a food table once a week, and there's several churches that do that. There are shelters. There's a lot of stuff. In fact, you know, there's a homeless network that's like a nationwide network, and they will let each other know where the best cities are for them to go. And Charlotte's one of the best. Charlotte's one of the best. And you know, they address the homeless problem, but every year there's 600-700 more homeless people than what there were the year before. Now, why is that? Well, some of it has to do with what's happened in the last year, but this has been going on for years. And it's because homeless people are coming in. Charlotte, climate-wise, is a pretty good place for people that camp out. You know, so they're and Charlotte's spending millions of dollars right now because there was a tent city that just got really bad, rats and stuff, and they closed it down, and they're spending $6 million to find housing for those people. because there were like 200 or 300 people in this tent city. All right. Well, you know, we need to be doing things as Christians and as the church to help people. And sometimes, like you were saying, that turning it over to an organization that roots those people out is really the best solution. And there are folks that really do a good job at that, like you said. So, and then I think, you know, just the fact that we talked about this, it's an ethical issue because, as RC said, there's value involved in it. And because of that, it becomes an ethical issue. Why do believers sometimes respond as if successful business profit is somehow ungodly?
Because they're stupid. Because they're
Well,
stupid.
I'm not so sure that this is a good question. No, you know why? You know why? Because I don't think believers have a problem with profit.
No, I mean, I was once talking with a guy at, and I said, you know, I've never had a poor person give me a job. And the lights went on. He said, oh, yeah.
Yeah. But I think for the most part, a believer, I think it would have somewhat of a better handle on what profit is. Because, you know, it's the liberals that are pushing this agenda that profit is a sinful thing. So I don't think this is quite an accurate.
You wonder who signs their paychecks. Because if you're not turning a profit, if all the companies I work for, if there was ever a time when they weren't turning a profit, we'd be out on the pavement.
Right.
Cut and dry. And that's real, you know, but you can explain that to a 10th grader.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's just this liberal thought of redistributing, that's not right, redistributing wealth.
Yeah, who do they work for? Are they a bunch of academic weenies or what?
Yeah, and see, the redistribution should be in my hand. How I redistribute, I'm having trouble saying that word, my resources, what I have at hand, how I take that and use that compassionately. And
exactly.
And that's where it should be. And that goes back to the fact that the church lost that ability.
Yeah. Well, these people that are yelling about reparations, okay, why don't they lead by example? How much are they willing to pay out of their own pockets?
Well, and you know, they say that they want reparations for people that were affected by slavery, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Didn't you tell me you had family ancestry involved in the Civil War?
Yeah.
Fought in the Civil War?
My great-great-grandfather was a Confederate general.
Okay, so he was affected by slavery.
Yeah.
Okay. You need to get some reparations for that because your family line has been affected by slavery when your great-great-great-grandfather went to war. Do you follow what I'm saying here? Everybody's been affected by slavery in this country, one way or the other.
600 boys from Iredell County alone died in that war.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I'm saying is, if you really want to be equitable on this, we all have been affected by slavery. Even if we didn't have, you know, my ancestors during the Civil War, I don't have any idea if any of my ancestors even fought in the Civil War, but I'm sure in the North, there were people that were affected by slavery, by the war, you know, which had to do with slavery and which had to do with, you know, because if
probably bought cotton shirts.
Yeah. So, you know, so So what I'm saying is there should be reparations for everybody.
Well, I'll
Because-
tell you, you know who should pay the reparations? Since the Democrats were the ones who owned the slaves and
yes,
fought so hard, let them pay the reparations.
yeah. So anyway, that's just my sort of, I say that sort of tongue in cheek, but seriously sense. And how is the Christian able to avoid the twin perils of radical spiritualism and radical materialism?
It goes back to Psalm 1, doesn't it?
Uh-huh.
On God's law, he meditates day and night.
Well, yeah, and radical spiritualism probably, if we define that, is sort of like a person that doesn't deal with things compassionately
Mm-hmm.
because they're so heavenly minded, they're no earthly
Yeah.
good. And then radical materialism is just the opposite of that. The materialism is the key there. And how does our understanding as God, as the creator of the world, affect our view of material resources, of our labor? I think Muller's article addresses this, and the first thing that he says, number one, in his Christian view of economics, is it must have God's glory as its greater aim.
Mm.
And I think that would help us with our material resources and our labor if we're thinking in terms of how is what I'm doing giving honor and glory to God.
You know, closely tied to that is a point that that Pastor Michael made in his Easter sermon. He says, the body is important and justice is important. All these things are important because of the resurrection. The resurrection makes those things important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And how does the culture confuse equity and equality? Well, equity is being fair. Equality is saying everything is equal.
Yes, and that's anything but fair.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's like, if somebody has worked their life at something and equality says, well, somebody else should have some benefit from that. And I think that's what that problem is. And how can we avoid making the same mistakes? Well, again, I think it gets back to what Muller is saying here. It must have God's glory as its greatest aim.
Well, even before the great white throne judgment, they're going to be the small and the great. The Bible doesn't say that there's anything wrong with
Right.
some people being small and others being great.
Yeah.
I mean, God distributes the gifts as he wishes. Now, we can surely muck it up and 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 make things askew or to screw things up,
Yeah.
so that it's not an even playing field. One of the latest examples being allow boys to compete as girls.
Yeah.
But you can rig the deck so that some people can never get anywhere, and you got to do something about that.
Yeah.
But to force equality of outcome, that's just the recipes for disaster.
All right. We are called by God to be stewards of the earth. Is that true or false?
That is true.
Yep. The Bible frequently reduces the essence of blank to justice and mercy.
Oh, let's see. I'm not. Oh, okay. The Bible frequently use the essence of godly behavior.
Yes. And blank is our essential for the creation of wealth, production.
All of the above.
There you go. Bill Everett. He says, anytime you see all of the above, choose that one because you got a 25% chance of being right.
We had a biology teacher who'd drive us nuts, who would have these alternatives and then more than one of the above and none of the above.
The strongest motivating force historically for socialism has been.
Huh. That's just the toss up between 3 and 4. Because socialism is a religion.
Well, compassion.
Oh, come on. I know he said that. I thought, wait a minute. Come on. For socialism?
He's talking about socialism in its purest form.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Because he says historically.
Yeah, Lenin's useful idiots, in other words.
Because I mean, there are some companies or countries that are socialistic that are doing okay. It's the ones that become obsessed with power through socialism. And see, I don't know that there's any place that's purely socialistic either that maybe I'm thinking of, because England tends to be socialistic, but they tend to be okay with it because they haven't been as crazy about the socialism, I don't think. But it's based on compassion. What's the best way that we can help people? And that's to spread the wealth. And again, it goes back to who is allowed, who should be spreading the wealth. I should be spreading my wealth as I see fit to do it.
And the socialists should be spreading their wealth. They should stop being generous with other people's money.
Well, again, I go back to the fact that there's some socialism that doesn't do that. Okay, we're seeing the socialism based on communism and that aspect of socialism, but there are countries that do function well under a socialistic type of government, but it's not what we're talking about here.
Well,
so and I can't put my finger on exactly where that would be, but and I don't think they're purely socialistic in every aspect, because I think they still allow for profit and things. They just do some things that for the benefit of everybody, but it's not necessarily the redistribution of wealth in those countries. I think that is something that we see in the communist countries, and we see in what the liberals are trying to do in our country now. But I think historically, socialism has not been as bad an idea as it